Good morning, everyone. We're here to discuss some crucial matters related to the death of Officer Randolph Holder and the safety of all New Yorkers. The death of Officer Holder has thrown into clear perspective the need for substantial reforms in the criminal justice system. We are united today, all of us standing together, calling for common sense reforms to the bail and diversion systems. And we share these concerns with major judicial leaders and prosecutorial leaders who believe, like we do, that something is fundamentally broken, both in terms of the way we treat hardened criminals and the way we treat low-level first-time offenders. Two people who share this deep concern with us, Chief Judge of New York State, Jonathan Lippman, couldn't be with us today, but has spoken extensively about the need for reform at both ends of the spectrum, and Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance, who as well has talked about the need for both types of reforms. And this is obviously a matter of urgency, and we need Albany to act as quickly as possible on these matters. Let me thank everyone who's gathered here, some of whom you'll hear speak in a moment, but I also want to acknowledge and thank Roy Richter, the president of the Captain's Endowment Association. We have worked with closely on a number of policy matters and has been obviously a strong voice for the men and women of the NYPD. I want to thank State Assembly member Luis Sepulveda, who we've worked very closely with on criminal justice matters. And I want to thank the chair of the City Council Courts and Legal Services Committee, who has been a key partner on issues related to bail reform, Rory Lantzman. Let's start with this tragedy that has focused all of our attention. And let's say at the outset, it shouldn't take a tragedy to focus our attention and make reform. Sometimes in human history, we know these tragedies cause action when nothing else does. And that's not a happy statement, but it's a blunt truth. And I'm a believer that when someone gave his life for us, as Officer Holder did, they cannot have died in vain. And some greater change, some greater good has to come out of it. And this is an example of something that must change. Tyrone Howard simply should not have been on the streets. Based on his criminal history, based on his history of recidivism, based on his constant violations of parole and probation, he just should not have been on the streets. And let's be clear, and it's a very sad, sad story. He was either in jail or prison or he was committing crimes. That is his life history, and someone like that should not have been in our communities, endangering members of the community and members of the NYPD alike. He was a hardened, violent criminal. It's quite clear from the facts. He was on the street. That, unfortunately, also is a fact, and the question is why. And we know there were two crucial opportunities that could have changed the situation fundamentally, but didn't, in large measure because our state laws are not properly structured. In October 2014, Howard was arrested and charged with felony drug sales. The judge in that case, like all New York State judges, could only set his bail based on the risk of flight. The judge was not able to consider the danger that Mr. Howard would be to public safety. It was literally by law not something that could be taken into consideration. So the criminal was able to post bail and again walk the streets. The second opportunity, in January 2015, a judge weighed Howard's eligibility for diversion into a drug treatment program instead of doing jail time. And because the judge was not required to consider the danger he posed, again, a decision was made that had very costly consequences, and Howard was sent to treatment. He didn't show up for treatment. Another part of this puzzle, when someone doesn't follow through on the mandates given them, and Howard had consistently not followed through in terms of parole and probation previously. So it's not a shock that he didn't show up for treatment, continued to walk the streets. And the bottom line here is, when the risk to the public cannot be legally considered, in the bail process, when it's not required to be considered in the diversion process, something is fundamentally wrong. And it inhibits judges from using their best judgment and doing their jobs to the fullest. Let's be clear. We think our judges need these tools to be able to do their jobs best, and they haven't had the tools. Tyrone Howard would have gone to jail. He would not have continued to poison the community around him by selling drugs. He wouldn't have been roaming East Harlem on Tuesday. And one of NYPD's good, decent, hard-working cops would still be alive today. So today, we renew our call for repair of these life-threatening cracks in the criminal justice system. We believe it's absolutely necessary to amend the state bail and diversion statutes and add the concept of public safety risk to these statutes, requiring judges to consider whether the defendant poses a danger to the community when deciding whether and how much bail to set. And that, by the way, and this is a shocking statistic, that is already the law in 47 states in this country. It is the law in the District of Columbia. It is the law governing our federal courts. Only New York State, Missouri, and Mississippi stand apart in not including this information and requiring its consideration. And the same requirement that the issue of public safety and the danger of the individual has to be considered by a judge in decisions related to the choice between treatment and jail. Now look, there is a balance that has to be struck. And a lot of us up here have talked for the last year or two about the need to address the other side of the equation, which is crucially urgent as well. Too many people have gone to jail or gone to prison who did not belong there. We're talking about low-level offenders, first-time offenders, folks who never did anything violent, folks for whom treatment and other options was a better alternative and, as we know, has worked in many cases. So we've got to have the maturity to look at both sides of the equation. We don't want people in jail or prison who shouldn't be there. We don't want to give up on redeeming people who can be redeemed. We want to recognize that it's in the public's interest to get low-level offenders to the right kind of treatment. But we also have to recognize that some people are just hardened criminals. Look at Howard's history. Same crimes over and over and over again. The same consistent pattern of violating all orders that were provided by courts. The same willingness to poison the community by selling drugs. And obviously, we know, acts of violence mixed in. It's not a mystery that, sadly, this individual had already set his life's course, and it was a dangerous course. We got to be able to look at that and say there are people like that, and we know, unfortunately, there are too many of them, who need to be in an institutional setting, whether it's a jail, a prison, a mental health institution. They should not be on our streets. And there's also a lot of people who were sent to jail and sent to prison who should never have been, who never rose to any level like that. And we've got to fix both sides of the equation. There are huge human consequences when we get either side of the equation wrong. We believe fundamentally that no one should end up in jail who is a low-level offender, and the only reason they're in jail is because they could not afford a modest bail. So we've got to be able to have a serious conversation in the city, in the state, about rebalancing the entire equation. But the bottom line is, both pieces have to be treated. And when it comes to the higher end of the scale, where real, serious criminals reside and get away with, somehow, get away with the revolving door reality and end up on the streets time and time again, we have to create an environment where those criminals are properly handled and are taken out of our society, and our surrounding communities are safe and our police officers are safe. This week, we learned the true cost of the problems that exist in our bail and diversion systems. And we realized what it means when our judges don't have the ability to weigh the danger that the defendant poses to our society. No more New Yorkers should have to pay the price for the errors in our laws. Our laws need to be fixed, and they need to be fixed soon. A few words in Spanish. La muerte del oficial Randolph Holder muestra la necesidad de reformar nuestro sistema de justicia penal. Una vez más, pedimos una reforma a las leyes estatales para que los jueces evalúen el peligro que los acusados representan para la comunidad antes de establecer fianzas, tratamientos de drogas o prisión. Si eso fuese así hoy, el asesino de Holder no habría vuelto a las calles y aún tendríamos entre nosotros a este buen hombre y buen policía. With that, I want to call forward a Speaker of the City Council. She and the Council have pushed for this balance in so many ways, and I think it's very important to note this history. They've been leading voices for reforming what I call the low end of the equation, for trying to make sure that people don't end up in prison or jail, don't belong there, that people are not forced into jail simply because they can't pay a modest bail, for looking at the right kind of diversion process. But at the same time, this City Council and this Speaker have fought strenuously to add 1,300 police to our streets, to give our police the most modern bulletproof vests, to balance the equation in favor of the safety of community and police alike. I want to commend her for that leadership and bring forward the Speaker of the City Council, Melissa Mark Viverito.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good morning to everyone. You know, obviously we all know that what happened on Wednesday was an incredible tragedy, and I personally care deeply about every single person who puts their life on the line to protect us, and this particularly hits close to home because it was literally close to home. Officer Holder gave his life protecting me, protecting my constituents, and the least that we can do in his honor as we extend our condolences to his family and to the city as a whole as we all grieve this process. And the NYPD in particular is, as the mayor has strongly put it and very eloquently put it, and made a strong case as to what we can do in his memory to make sure that we protect others in the future. So, you know, we are very interested in creating that balance, in making sure that our criminal system is more fair and just, and the City Council is working hard towards that goal. Under Chair Landsman's leadership, we had a hearing earlier this year on the challenges of bail, of the proposal of our bail fund, and the issue of the limitations that judges have in what they can consider when it comes to letting someone out is really hampering the ability to create that balance. So, you know, this council has approached this issue of reforms in a thoughtful and deliberative manner, and we are going to continue to do so. We're being deliberative because we need to take these issues very seriously and get them right. And what we're talking here is about handcuffing judges and being able to really exercise fully their discretion. And I think this also are parallels when you talk about the issue of mandatory minimum sentences and judges not having the ability. There's parallels here about what we need to do to create more balance in the system. We want to make sure that our criminal justice system continues to keep people safe. We need to strike the right balance, and that is what we are discussing here today. And that is why the proposed legislation that the mayor laid out at the state level is so important. That recommendation, hopefully we can get that passed, will keep people safe, will keep our city safe, while also striking that middle ground that we're all looking for. Judges, we all know, have very complicated and complex jobs, and we need to ensure that they have everything they need to make smart and thoughtful decisions. These decisions are very difficult to make, and judges should be commended for their professionalism and their service. And having, obviously, Judge Lippman on board as an incredible validator, I think it really speaks volumes that he is definitely supporting this. He's been an incredible fighter to make sure that the system is more fair and just, and really happy that he is on board as we move forward. So I'm confident that we can work with our colleagues at the state level and in Albany to get this done, and definitely look forward to getting to work on this, as I'm sure Chair Landsman is as well. I'll say a couple of words in Spanish. Lo que sucedió este miércoles fue una tragedia. Así que mi más sentido pésame a la familia del policía Holder, al comisionado Bratton y toda la comunidad policíaca y también a todos los residentes de la ciudad de Nueva York. Queremos hacer que nuestro sistema de justicia criminal sea uno más justo y el Consejo está trabajando fuertemente a estos fines. Por eso hemos hecho reformas de una manera deliberada y lo continuaremos haciendo. También queremos que nuestro sistema de justicia criminal mantenga a la gente segura. Tenemos que mantener un balance correcto y estoy segura que lo lograremos. La legislación que el alcalde está recomendando hace precisamente eso, pues tiene sentido común. Los jueces tienen un trabajo complicado y tenemos que asegurar que tengan todas las herramientas que necesiten para tomar decisiones inteligentes y pensadas. Y los reconocemos por su profesionalismo. Y así que estoy segura que trabajaremos con nuestros colegas en el Albany y lograremos hacer que estos cambios se logren. Gracias.
Thank you very much. In the mayor's office, we have been working on the different elements of the reforms needed. And two crucial voices in this process, I want to thank them both. First, our Corporation Counsel, Zach Carter, and I remind you, in addition to his current role, in his previous work, he focused as U.S. Attorney on both addressing serious crime and trying to create balance in our criminal justice system. And the Director of the Mayor's Office on Criminal Justice, Liz Glazer, who has been working with all elements of the criminal justice system, our courts, our DAs, NYPD, all agencies, in terms of determining the kind of reforms we need going forward. I'd like to welcome Liz Glazer to speak to us now.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The mayor and this administration has been very, very clear. Dangerous people should be in, and people who do not pose a risk to public safety should be released and await trial in their neighborhoods and with their families. But current state law leaves us all very vulnerable. The simple fact is that judges need to be able to consider whether this defendant who's standing in front of them would flee or would harm others if they were released. But right now, judges can only consider risk of flight when setting bail, not dangerousness. And this is really anachronistic and unacceptable. I think a little-known fact that the mayor has pointed to today is that we are one of only 3 states that prohibit judges from considering public safety risk when setting bail. We've been calling for this change to state law for nearly a year, and the tragic events of this last week make it clear that we need to move with urgency to add dangerousness to the bail and diversion statutes. Risk should be the neutral principle that determines whether someone is in or someone is out. And this is true for low-risk people who should be able to wait for trial at home, and it's true for high-risk defendants who we need to make sure are off the street. And moving to this risk-driven system will ensure that law enforcement resources are directed, as they should be, to public safety threats and not towards low-level folks. A risk-based system will ensure that low-risk people are not detained solely because of poverty, and will also ensure that judges have the tools they need to protect the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Fine, I'd like us to hear from someone who has perspective from all sides of the equation. Eric Adams spent 22 years as a New York City police officer, rising to the rank of captain, has a profound understanding of what it takes to keep people in this city safe and the tools that are needed to improve that system. He also understands deeply the problems of many, many families going through the agony caused by the problems at the low end of our bail and diversion system as well. So he sees the whole picture, the dangers our community is faced with because truly hardened criminals remain on the street, and the problems because we don't have the proper approaches in terms of low-level offenders as well. I'd like to welcome Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Speaker, for your partnership around this issue. It's such an important issue, and I think that on the state level, there needs to be a due task force or meeting of the minds, how we look at the bail system altogether, introducing technology. Low-level offenders can wear anything from ankle bracelets and other methods that will ensure the return to court when the time calls for them to do so. What's important is that we look at the intangible, because part of this conversation is not reaching the real conversation on the ground. Nothing erodes our trust in the criminal justice system more than when those who are the victims of violence are watching the most violent offenders return to the streets while those who do low-level crimes are sitting in jail. That is a terrible mix. And when you look at two shootings, that really touches me. As I was speaking with the president of the Captains Union, Roy Richter, two shootings really personifies this. One happened in the 88th Precinct, and the shooting that took place that we lost an officer, and most recently, the offenders who were involved in these shootings were multiple shooters, and they were exchanging gunfires with officers as they were fleeing. You do not see many shootings like that. When you reach a comfort level that you can live out some scene in a police movie and return shootings with officers with multiple shooters. In the 88th Precinct, our officers were under fire from different directions, and the caliber of bullets, 40 caliber bullets, larger ammunition that pierced the police vehicle. And so when you look at the aggressive and boldness of those who are career criminals who are on a pathway to violence should not be colliding with police officers or innocent people. And the bail system currently allows that to happen. We can't have those who are career criminals make a mockery of our criminal justice system. And we must find ways to take the handcuffs off judges and keep the handcuffs on those who have made up their minds that they're going to be violent career criminals. And some people may look at the call to reform our bail system to make sure that those who are committing petty offenses but don't have the economic means to bail themselves out, one may interpret that as being soft on crime. Hell no, it's not. It is the right direction to go. Our jails should be places that is held for those who commit the most violent actions. And far too often, they not only slip through the crack, they aggressively and boldly walk through the crack just to return to the streets and participate in violent behavior. And that's the focus. The focus is to ensure that judges are able to look at the person in front of them and make a clear determination. Should this person or individual return to the streets of the city of New York, or should they be held incarcerated until the determination is made that the crime that they committed, they should go to jail for? That's what we have fallen short. And so I believe here's an opportunity to create a law that will be named after this officer. Albany must fast-track this. In the 2016 legislative session. This must be at the top of the agenda. Enough of the conversation. The Assembly must get on board with this issue. I'm hoping that they see the seriousness of it. This is not soft on crime, and this is not an extension of making the criminal justice procedure more to penalize those who are low-level offenders. This is the right direction to go. Bad people should go to jail. And you are not going against a liberal view for understand that. There are bad people in this state. And bad people who do bad things must go to a place where bad people go, and that is the criminal justice system, and that's the prison system in our nation. This individual should not have been on the street. His roadway to destruction should not have collided with an innocent officer or the countless number of innocent victims who may have been victimized by his action. We just so happened that we took the life of an officer, but we only know how many lives this person may have taken and could have been responsible for, because the stats show there's a numerical minority of people who continue to commit crimes until they are caught. And the ones that are committing serious violent offenses must be held accountable for it, and we must use the bail system to ensure that they don't return to the street. So this is crucial. This is important. And again, I want to commend the mayor and the speaker for taking this very bold and aggressive move towards bail reform. The governor and the state must pick up. The governor has moved through legislation that he thought was important. Now it's time for his leadership to move through this legislation, because this is important and it impacts a countless number of communities that have given up on the criminal justice system because they see the most heinous, violent offenders return to the streets while the petty offenders remain incarcerated. That is the wrong thing to do, the wrong message to do, and that sends the wrong message to those of us who believe that the penalty must meet the crime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just one point to amplify what the borough president is saying. Commissioner Bratt and Chief O'Neill, they'll tell you that's a few thousand violent criminals who are causing a huge percentage of the violent crime in New York City. That's really striking to recognize. Almost 8.5 million people in this city. A few thousand are causing a huge percentage of the violence. And again, I think the borough president is exactly right. We have a pretty clear pattern on who these people are. And NYPD works every day to get them off the streets. We need state laws that will help us to do it. But there's many, many more New Yorkers who are law-abiding, obviously the vast majority law-abiding. And there's some who have had lesser offenses, small offenses, who can be redeemed, and there's ways to do it. But look how out of balance we are. We are, I think Eric said it perfectly, too punitive to folks that can be turned around. And somehow some of the most hardened criminals never actually are caught in the net. Only these changes in state law will allow us to do that. We're going to take questions on this topic specifically. Andrew.
Mayor, you've made the case that low-risk offenders should be able to wait for their trial date at home, and high-risk offenders shouldn't be out at all. But wouldn't there be a huge number of cases that are essentially medium risk, where the judge has to make the call? The judge in this case, the Tyrone Howard case, said he didn't have a crystal ball. He felt in his judgment, given the facts, that he was a candidate for diversion. How would that change countless other examples where you have someone in the middle?
I'm going to start from a non-lawyer, common sense perspective, from my point of view. I'm going to welcome Zach and Liz to fill in the blank here. What we know in this case, and we've seen the transcript, it's publicly available, is that this judge certainly knew that there's a pattern of criminal offenses. There's just nothing mysterious about this. So I said, Mr. Howard was either in jail or prison, or he was committing crimes. It's pretty consistent over a long period of time. And it was clear that there had been parole and probation violations, which also speaks intensely in this point. When we talk about low-level folks on the other side of the spectrum, we're talking about people who respond to the directions of a court. If they're supposed to wear a bracelet, they're supposed to appear at certain points, or go to parole, whatever it may be, or go to probation, I should say, whatever it may be, do community service, do treatment. They're responding to those instructions, and that's part of what validates that they are worthy of that type of approach. Here's someone who never responded to the instructions, who violated orders of courts consistently while continuing criminal activity, and we know that the 2009 shooting was visible on the transcript, even though in that instance the prosecutors could not put together a sufficient case. It was still clear that that information was available to the judge. So I would argue in this case there was ample evidence to go a different path. But the bigger point here is that because the question of dangerousness to the community, is not an applicable measure in the bail decisions and is not required to be considered in the diversion situations, it does handcuff judges. It doesn't allow them to consider the things they should consider. And it underemphasizes a thing that the vast majority of us would say would be the very first question we want to ask. Is this person a dangerous threat to the rest of us? So I think it's common sense. Zach, Liz, you want to add?
I have been a criminal court judge, and I've made countless decisions about pretrial release. I have never met a colleague who wants to release someone knowing that they might be a danger to the community. But they find themselves in a situation where they feel constrained from detaining persons who may well be dangerous because there's nothing in their rap sheet that signals that they will not return to court, which is right now the only legal consideration that can be taken into account, except in a very narrow range of cases. So what we need by this legislation that's being proposed is to add truth into the bail process so that judges can openly consider what their gut instincts always tell them they want to consider, and that's dangerousness. Right now, judges would like to consider it. In some cases, there are other indications that sometimes mimic dangerousness that permit a judge to articulate a reason to detain someone in terms of risk of flight. But then there are going to be those situations where there are strong indications of dangerousness, but a defendant has no warrant history. A defendant has always faithfully returned to court. Dangerousness has to be something that a judge can consider separately and openly and honestly.
Liz Glazer.
So just quickly, because it's a great question, it's not just is somebody released with nothing or is somebody held in, but we need a range of things in between. That's part of what bail can do, like the Speaker's Bail Fund. That's part of what supervised release does. And so the real issue here is let's craft the solution to either letting somebody out or keeping them in that will ensure that keeps us all safe.
Chair Lansman.
Well, it's important to remember that there were two judicial decisions in this case which were important. The diversion, the decision to divert him to a drug treatment program, but also the decision to grant him bail. What happens is judges will frequently, if they sense that a defendant is dangerous to the community, but they are constrained to limit their decision based on the defendant's potential flight risk, is set bail at a very, very high amount, or at least an amount that they think that the defendant cannot make, in the hopes that it will achieve the same end, keep the guy in jail until his trial date. In this case, the bail was set at $35,000, which is not an insignificant bail number. So I suspect that the judge who handled this arraignment, she looked at this defendant, she sensed dangerousness. Had she had an opportunity to make an open determination, she might have articulated that. But in the absence of that, she set what she thought was probably a high enough bail to keep him in jail. Now, somehow he came up with the money to make that bail, probably with the proceeds of his criminal activity, because he had nothing else financially going on with his life. And, you know, what the mayor is trying to do here and what we're trying to do is bring this conversation of dangerousness out into the open so that judges can use their judgment and we can all see, you know, why it is that people are being released or not being released.
And just one other point on that. Had the law been changed, if it were the law we're talking about, that same judge that Rory was referring to could have also chosen not to offer bail. That would have been an option if dangerousness could have been fully considered. So a lot of things could have been very different in this case. Dave.
On Wednesday, when this all came up, though, I mean, we talked with the spokesperson for the judges for the Manhattan criminal court system, and he said, this is the perfect kind of candidate who should be considered for drug. Now, let me finish. And I asked him, I said, well, what about his violent past? He said, the judge, it's due process to look and see what are the criminal convictions. There were none on violence. So how can you say this is due process if you're just going to like...
I'm going to start. I believe firmly on this one, and again, I'll welcome Zach and Liz to fill in blanks here. They're much more learned on this than I, but the common sense here rules the day. First of all, this is not about this individual judge. I don't know this judge. I have no reason to believe this is anything but a devoted public servant. I think he made the wrong decision. By the way, the best validation, in my view, is that a highly respected District Attorney, Cy Vance, indicated to the judge through his folks that they wanted a 6-year sentence for this individual, that that's what they were going for, based on a tremendously clear pattern of criminal activity that did endanger other folks. Dave, let's be clear, drug dealing endangers people's lives. Let's not suggest that the only way to endanger someone's life is by holding a weapon in your hand. Drug dealing endangers the lives of people, particularly our youth. And if that were the only question, if you had someone who had sold drugs once, but no, he had sold drugs repeatedly. He was associated with gangs that were known to be violent. The shooting in 2009 was clear to the judge. On top of that, a history of violating parole and probation orders. I don't know how anyone could see anything but a clear pattern of criminal activity and one that clearly put people's lives in danger. So to me, it's quite straightforward. But don't believe me. Believe the DA who asked for 6 years. Zach, Liz, anything to add? No? Yes? Okay. Go ahead.
I want to think on the other side of the spectrum, the people that end up on Rikers not being able to make bail, and I think of Khalid Browder. What would you say to the judge in that case? And New York One has reported that that judge was actually Darcel Clark. She saw him 6 times. What would you say to her?
I'm going to keep it broad, and Zach and Liz, again, who are much more expert, might want to add. But my broad point, I don't want to talk about that case because I don't know all the details of that case. I want to talk about the broad reality that we know for a fact that there are low-level offenders, first-time offenders, absolutely nonviolent offenders, folks who can and will follow through on commitments and directives from the court, folks who can be redeemed. We know a lot of those folks have ended up in jail or prison, and it's destroyed their lives and their families' lives needlessly. We know that people have ended up in Rikers simply because they couldn't afford a low level of bail, $250. And if you got $250 bail, it means the entire criminal justice system has decided you're not a threat. Why should anyone like that end up in Rikers, which is only going to make their situation worse, in fact, raise the chance of them becoming a hardened criminal in the process, cost the taxpayers, cause additional strains on our criminal justice system. So we're out of balance on both ends. I believe this fundamentally. And I think improving the reforms at the low end is necessary, but I think empowering the judges at the high end to consider dangerousness is equally necessary. We got to get both pieces in balance here.
In response to the prior question, at the end of the day, a judge's decision with respect to both bail and ultimate disposition of a case and sentencing are going to be subjective. They're going to be based on subjective factors. And what is being proposed today is that there's legislation that helps guide that discretion. Doesn't take it away, because there are always going to be tough cases. There are always going to be cases that are in that gray area. But right now we have a court system that has been guided by a century-old statute that commands judges to practically ignore dangerousness. And all we are talking about is legislation that restores balance so that we create a culture in which judges take into consideration both risk of flight and dangerousness. And in this case, without second-guessing the judge, there was a combination. There was an indication of both dangerousness, and maybe that was not as hard as it is and well documented as it has in some cases, but there was certainly evidence of risk of flight. And when you take those things in combination, which this court was not entitled to do, that might have suggested a different outcome with respect to whether or not he was an appropriate candidate for diversion.
We have the, hold on a second, speaker. No, you can, you're good. Speaker.
I mean, I just want to, affirm, and the mayor just made the case, what we've been talking about for the past year with regards to the issue of a citywide bail fund to really try to prevent exactly that from happening, where the mayor and I could both be charged with the same low-level nonviolent offense and both be given $250 bail, but he has the resources to pay it. He can go and wait outside until his day in court, and I have to sit in Rikers for 2 weeks and potentially lose my job, lose custody of my children, lose my housing, all the implications that comes with that. That's where the lack of balance is very clear. So yes, on the repeat offenders and those that are a risk to our communities, definitely we need to give the judges the ability to fully exercise their full discretion. On the lower scale, there are too many, and our borough president alluded to that as well, that are sitting in jail, and there are societal consequences to that. They can become the hardened criminals, they can lose their job, they can lose custody of their children, and then there's a cost obviously attached to that for the family and for the city. So there's a lot to discuss here. These are very complicated issues. And at times, there's an attempt to overly generalize them and try to oversimplify them, and you can't. It's an injustice to try to simplify these conversations, and we're being extremely deliberative and thoughtful because the balance is needed and justice is needed for all involved, and that's the things that we're weighing.
Mayor, your administration has talked a lot about money bail and how it's a problem
This is sort of a two-part question. One, I mean, let's say these changes were made and the judge is able to consider dangerousness. What do you think the judge should then be doing in a situation like this one? Should there have been a high cash bail? Should there have been some other kind of monitoring or remand? And then as the second part, as we've been talking about whether or not a judge should have known that this person would be dangerous or not, the judge has said no violent convictions. You've referenced this 2009 shooting, but he was never convicted of that. I mean, should people be put in jail or in prison based on things that they haven't been convicted of doing?
Again, I think the most powerful part of the evidence is a consistent pattern of criminal activity. No one's debating that. When I say this individual was either in jail or prison or committing crimes as a factual statement over many, many years, I don't think it's academic. I don't think it's gray. It's quite clear. Second, that he had repeatedly violated court orders in terms of parole and probation, also clear. So that's enough right there to suggest that, and I'm saying this as a layman, I'm not a lawyer, I haven't walked a mile in the judge's shoes, but I think common sense would dictate if you had the ability that the new law would give, you would either not offer bail because of the consistency of this individual's activities and the fact that drug dealing, again, does lead to horrible negative consequences for those taking the drugs. It's not a victimless situation. And you would conclude either no bail or a very high bail, so that, ironically, he couldn't pay the bail with his drug proceeds. So that would be my common sense solution, that this would have all been taken into account. Now, again, the transcript did make clear that there was an arrest and an allegation of involvement in a shooting. I think it was quite clear that in those situations, sometimes it's hard to get people to testify against the shooter because there are either other people involved or for what reasons that I think are very unfortunate. People don't want to share what they know with the police. That's something we have to work to resolve in terms of building a deeper connection between police and community and getting more and more people to come forward. But the fact was, it was an important indicator of something being wrong. And finally, and I think this is the part that has to be amplified in this discussion, if the district attorney is asking for 6 years, I think that was a very strong indication to the judge that the district attorney looked at that whole body of evidence and saw something there. I think that should have been weighed, from my point of view, more strongly. Marsha.
It's really ironic that this man would have been on the street anyway because he was able to make $35,000 bail, which is really a 10% cash alternative or $3,500. I wonder if you think that the law changes that you're asking for will send a message to members of the judiciary that in cases where there's a danger or a public risk, that they should set high bail, no bail, and not let these people out. Will it send a message to them, it's okay to do that?
Yes, I think the fact is, again, we believe in the discretion of our judges and we respect their judgment. That's the role they play. But I think it simply says you have the right, you have the option to set a higher bail or to determine no bail because you can look at all the factors. It defies common sense that a judge is not allowed to consider the dangerousness of the individual. That is a fundamental flaw in our law. And again, don't believe me, believe the other 47 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government, all of which give judges the right to look at dangerousness in the equation. I'm not sure I agree with you on the previous assumption, because had this law been in effect, again, I think that judge might have been in a position to set either a bail that could not have been reached economically or to say that it was not appropriate to have bail. So I don't think we can know because this law wasn't there for that judge to work with.
That was my question. I mean, $35,000 bail doesn't, when you can pay $3,500 and get a bail and want them to do it, isn't that onerous for somebody who's selling drugs?
Correct.
So the question really was that if this law was in effect, does it put pressure on judges to
I don't think pressure is the right word, and I'm going to, again, I'm going to use my common sense terminology, and Zach and Liz fill in the blank to give more refined legal terminologies here. What we're saying is, I think Zach said it perfectly, imagine you're a judge and you're not allowed to consider the dangerousness of the person before you. That makes no sense. And this is something we've spoken about before. This is something that came up back at the end of last year, a case where an individual was making threats against the police, and the judge was not allowed to consider those threats in the bail determination because there was no risk of flight evident. That makes no sense. So it's not about pressuring judges, it's about empowering them and giving them the tools and the right to look at the dangerousness of the individual and factor that into bail determinations. and requiring it to be considered in terms of a diversion option. And I think what will happen is, I think this is the nature of the many, many good judges we have. They look at a situation and they say, this is borderline, I'm not sure I can be comfortable that this individual won't do an act of violence and won't keep committing crimes, and I'm worried this individual will not follow through on the orders. That's when you set a higher bail, or obviously, particularly in cases of violence, you have the option of no bail. You want to add, clarify?
No, I don't.
My layman's terms worked in that case. I was in the ballpark. Matt, yes.
Mayor, do you believe people are innocent until proven guilty?
Of course.
Okay, if that's the case, why are you considering things for which people aren't convicted?
I think the fact is that district attorneys provide, and I'm going to start again, non-lawyer, let the legal experts come in. District attorneys provide judges with their guidance and their understanding based on a wealth of information. It is not any one thing. So don't warp the situation here, respectfully. The pattern of criminal activity, the pattern of violating parole and probation, this is such a clear pattern. Again, if the reason this individual was not prosecuted for a gun violation is because the other people involved would not testify against him, it doesn't make it any less true that he had a gun and was using a gun. And that information was visible to the judge. So I absolutely believe in fundamental constitutional rights, but I also believe in common sense. And I think there was enough evidence there, and I think the judge was getting a clear enough signal from the DA to handle this differently.
Mr. Mayor, does your legislation include then, or your proposal for it, who is then eligible for a diversion program? Would it be then non-felony offenders?
Let me offer
rehab people?
Let me offer a broad point, and then again, I very much want Zach and Liz to come in and fill in the blanks here. We are, all of us, united, and we're united with Judge Lippman, we're united with DA Vance in calling for a fundamental change. The broad strokes here have been talked about for quite a while. The head of our state judicial system has called for these kind of reforms. Literally the #1 person in our state judiciary has been calling for both types of reforms, on the low end and the high end. It's time for action. We are not state legislators. It's up to the state legislature, we have a member here, Assemblymember Sepulveda, to craft the legislation. And we'll certainly do all we can to support that process. I think what we're saying is there's a lot of us that are asking Albany to act because it will change the reality on the ground. It will improve the work of our judges. It will improve the work of our prosecutors. It will improve the work of our police. We're not putting before you final language. That has to be worked out with all the stakeholders, obviously, in particular the Assembly and the Senate. But we're saying there's a broad consensus here, and we represent a lot of different parts of the equation. And obviously, DA Vance and Judge Lippman, crucial pieces of the equation, we all agree that something needs to happen on both sides of the equation. We agree on the broad strokes of what it should be. As to what might be the examples of people who qualify for diversion, who wants to jump in?
Sure. Again, that's going to be a subjective determination based on a judge's assessment of whether or not a particular candidate, based on their criminal history and whatever probation authorities who conducted a probation investigation of an offender present to the court, whether or not this is a person who's likely to succeed in whatever program they're being diverted to, and whether or not they will continue to live up to the terms of whatever the diversion program are. And there are a lot of factors that are going to be taken into account. You know, has this person, what is the quality of their criminal record? Has been violent? Has been nonviolent? The point of the proposed, the outlines of the legislation that are being proposed today is that courts are not currently, particularly with respect to bail, permitted to take dangerousness into consideration. That in evaluating the risk of release, the only thing a judge is legally entitled to take into account is whether or not that defendant is going to return to court. And that program, that creates a certain culture and programs a certain reflex that says, well, in the absence of an indication that this person is not going to appear, then I have no choice but to release him. And it carries over to the diversion context, because there's no restriction in law in sentencing that doesn't permit judges to take dangerousness into consideration, but there's nothing that encourages them to do it either. And so this is about, to some extent, changing culture and rebalancing the system so that when judges are making a judgment about whether or not someone is a likely candidate for a diversion program, they are allowed to and encouraged to take into consideration whether or not the risk of harm to the public outweigh the benefits of the diversion program.
All right. Okay, Roy Richter.
So I just wanted to, Councilman Landsman brought up a good point. There's about two things, about bail and about the diversion program. A train wreck is not appropriate for diversion. And it's to the extent that this legislation provides some type of an element of common sense to a judge to make a decision, especially when they have a submission from a district attorney that recommends a substantial penalty, that's a positive thing. It gets to be borderline insulting when you come to it after a tragedy and the murder of a police officer, where we talk about legislation to make things better. But if things can move in a right direction, it's something that needs to happen. You know, when you talked about the person was convicted, not convicted, you know, who's appropriate for diversion? There's a lot of city resources that get devoted to a person that's going to be in a diversion program. Are you going to give those resources to somebody that's arrested for buying, selling drugs, violent acts over a dozen times, or are you going to give it to the kid that was locked up once or twice for possession? I think common sense would hold that you give it to the kid that was arrested once or twice, and you don't give it to a person, a murderer, who is looking to manipulate the system for a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Okay. Chair Landsman wanted to add something.
Sure. Very quickly, the statute that's on the books that allows these drug court cases, that allows the diversions, is very, very narrow. It prohibits participants who have been convicted of a violent felony, I think within the last 10 years, people who are charged with currently a violent felony. But it needs to be made broader. It needs to be made clear that there are other public safety considerations that should be considered in terms of who is going to be diverted. It's not the case that the drug courts are admitting people into diversion programs willy-nilly. I think less than half of the defendants who are recommended for screening for a drug diversion program were actually accepted. But right now, the limitations, the prohibitions, are just too narrow, and they need to be made broader so that the kind of common sense considerations that the mayor is talking about, that Roy is talking about, can also be factored.
Thank you. Let me just let Assemblymember Sepulveda speak to this, and then we'll take a few more.
First of all, I want to congratulate the mayor, the speaker, and everyone here for their efforts to reform the bail system. Now, as a member of the legislature, I represent one of the districts that has a high level of crime. And if any district and the individuals there are impacted greatly on both ends, on the low end and the high end, it's a community that I represent. I'm also a member of the Black, Hispanic, Asian Caucus. And we have been talking about criminal justice reform for some time now, working with the mayor's office, the speaker, to reform the bail system and other systems in the state. Now, let me tell you, I've spoken with individuals in my district who are impacted on both ends of the spectrum, people who have family members that have been in prison for far too long for low-level offenses, young men and women who then get a scarlet letter and make it hard for them to succeed in life in the future. But I can tell you that in my discussions in the last couple of days with constituents of my district, there wasn't a single person, not a single person, who doesn't agree with the concept that we should take the potential for violence, the potential for danger of a person who's before the criminal justice system, and that a judge should take that into effect. Now, look, judges are given the assignment to run our criminal justice system in the courts, and they will make mistakes. But I believe that this piece of legislation will make a great difference. I believe that the members of the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Caucus will favor this legislation. I've spoken with some of my colleagues who think this is a great idea, and it's an idea that will impact our communities who are victimized by these individuals who are arrested time and again and go back into the community and commit more crimes and victimize the community. So thank you very much for your efforts.
Thank you. Thank you. Ozzy.
Two questions. Have you spoken with Governor Cuomo and Assembly Leader Casey about these changes? And secondly, given how Albany sometimes doesn't act as quickly as the city wants, is there anything that New York City police officers or city government can do while these state laws are currently in place that, as Winter said, has put New Yorkers in danger?
On the first question, we've just begun reaching out to the stakeholders in Albany. We'll certainly talk to all the key players in Albany. And I think, as you heard from the Assembly member, I think a lot of them already believe that these changes are needed. And I think we'll find a lot of voices from the city. But again, the voice that we should be paying attention to first is the chief judge of the state, who's already called for these things, and I think is a figure held in tremendous regard all over the state. So we're looking forward to those discussions and figuring out how we can all work together to make these changes. On the second question, look, we need the law change. Again, Zach and Liz can add anything here. We need the law change for judges to have the discretion in the case of bail and to ensure that dangerousness is considered in the case of diversion. We can't do that without a law change. We'll continue to work on the other side of the equation because I've said very clearly, we have a national problem and a history of mass incarceration that included many, many people who should never have been in jail or prison and certainly should not have been as long as they were in many cases. And we are doing some things here in the city to fundamentally change that reality. We'll continue to do that. But on the high end of the scale, where the hardened, violent, consistent criminals reside, there's a conversation we have been having for a long time with our weekly meetings I have with Commissioner Bratton and his leadership team, the frustration that they have, that they see these hardened criminals who somehow manage to evade the justice system consistently. Liz Glazer has been leading our effort to work with judges, to work with DAs, to tighten up in every way possible. But one of the big sticking points is that this law doesn't allow the judges the proper discretion. So we can't get where we need to go without the law change. Final question, yeah.
Mr. Howard, even if he hadn't been sent to the drug diversion program, would have, there was a plea deal for him to go to jail for 2 years, and then he would have been out again. But theoretically, but you're suggesting that he is a hardened, violent, irredeemable criminal. How does this in any way change or address the fact that you're saying he's not a person who should live in society?
I'm not sure I follow your question. There's a clear pattern of criminal activity and a clear pattern of violating the parole and probation orders. And in fact, had the law been changed, I think the outcomes could have been very different. And I think the fact that the DA was asking for 6 years, again, is a crucial part of this equation. If you're saying, well, there's a violent criminal and at some point they finish their prison term and they're still a danger to us, that is a real problem in our society. But the bottom line here is if this law had been changed, if all along the way criminals like Mr. Howard were addressed differently, I think you would have seen escalating penalties. And again, I'm speaking as a layman. Zach and Liz can come in and clarify. But I think what you see here, and I wish I could say this was the only case I've seen this in, but I spent a lot of time going over such cases with Commissioner Bratton and Chief O'Neill and Deputy Commissioner Dermot Shea for operations. There is a pattern of these kind of cases where more and more criminal activity does not lead to more and more consequences. And that's where I think the system's fundamentally broken. Someone who committed this many crimes in this clear a pattern should have been subject to higher and higher consequences each time. It was inconceivable to me that someone like this should be on the street. Some people are irredeemable. I'm a progressive person. I am a humanitarian, but I can also tell you some people are irredeemable. And unless they are treated very, very differently, they pose a danger to our society, and we have to look that in the face. Do you want to add, Liz, Zach? Okay. With that, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.